Walt Disney World is 43 square miles of the most photographed real estate on the planet, and every inch of it was planned within an inch of its life. But not everything Disney planned actually got built. Some ideas got fully designed, funded, promoted, and then quietly buried before a single guest ever saw them. Others got built, opened their doors, ran for years, and were still eventually left to rot in the Florida heat. So today, we're counting down 5 abandoned Disney World projects you've never heard of. Number 5. Discovery Island. Most people who visit Walt Disney World have no idea there's an actual abandoned island sitting in the middle of Bay Lake, visible from the shoreline, that Disney has left to the jungle for over 2 decades. It started out in 1974 as Treasure Island, a themed attraction based on Disney's 1950 film of the same name, complete with a wrecked pirate ship on the shore. Guests took a boat out to the 11.5-acre island, wandered past caves and buried treasure, and generally treated it as a quirky little side trip from the main parks. Disney even used the island as a filming location for a 1976 movie called Treasure of Metacomb. But the pirate theme didn't really stick. The island's actual wildlife, birds, tortoises, and eventually a genuinely impressive collection of exotic animals, turned out to be more interesting to guests than the pirate backstory. So in 1977, Disney rebranded the whole place as Discovery Island and leaned all the way into the zoological angle instead. For the next 2 decades, Discovery Island quietly built a real reputation among animal lovers. It housed one of the largest walk-through aviaries in the world at the time, along with flamingos, cranes, tortoises, and even the last known dusky seaside sparrow, a bird that went extinct in 1987. It won an award from the American Zoo and Aquarium Association for excellence in its animal care programs, a distinction plenty of guests who visited the island probably never even realized they were looking at. This wasn't some forgotten roadside attraction. It was a legitimately respected little zoo, tucked away on a lake most guests only ever saw from a resort balcony. Then, on April 8, 1999, exactly 25 years after it first opened, Disney closed Discovery Island for good. The animals were relocated to the brand new Disney's Animal Kingdom, which had opened the year before and made a standalone zoo attraction somewhat redundant. Disney never gave an official public explanation, but the likely combination of factors is pretty easy to guess. High maintenance costs for a boat access-only island, declining attendance once Animal Kingdom offered essentially the same experience without the ferry ride, and a company that had just spent a fortune building a much bigger animal-focused park a few miles away. Online, the closure has picked up a fair amount of urban legend baggage over the years too, including a persistent but unconfirmed theory tying it to Naegleria fowleri, a rare freshwater organism connected to a tragic death at a nearby Disney water park around the same era. Disney has never confirmed that as a reason, and the far more boring explanation, an aging attraction competing against a bigger, newer version of itself, is almost certainly the real one. What happened next is the part that actually makes this one interesting. Disney didn't tear the island down. It didn't redevelop it. It just walked away. The ticket booths, the pathways, the animal enclosures, even a wall calendar still flipped open to a page from 1999, all of it just sat there, reclaimed slowly by subtropical vegetation. A weathered faux shipwreck called the Walrus, left over from the old Treasure Island days, is still reportedly visible from the water along the shoreline. Disney has never opened the island back up, has banned staff and guests from setting foot on it, and in 2016 reportedly banned a photographer named Seth Lawless for life after he published drone and zoom lens footage of the abandoned buildings. There were rumors over the years about turning the island into a tie-in attraction for the video game Myst, developed with Cyan Worlds, or repurposing it as some kind of private retreat, but none of it ever went anywhere. Today, Animal Kingdom's central hub is even named Discovery Island as a kind of nod to the original, which is a nice touch, except the original Discovery Island is still sitting a few miles away, unclaimed by nature preserve or theme park, existing in the exact kind of limbo Disney doesn't usually allow anywhere on its property. Number 4, the Western River Expedition. If you ask serious Disney historians to name the single most famous attraction Disney never built, most of them will say the same thing: the Western River Expedition. It's become something of a holy grail among theme park enthusiasts, precisely because it got so far along and because so much surviving concept art exists to torment people with what could have been. When Walt Disney World's Magic Kingdom opened in October 1971, it copied most of Disneyland's greatest hits, except one. There was no Pirates of the Caribbean. That wasn't an oversight. Imagineers, led by legendary animator turned designer Mark Davis, had a different plan entirely. Davis wasn't some junior designer trying to make a name for himself either. He'd spent decades as one of Walt's most trusted animators, credited with designing characters ranging from Cruella de Vil to Tinker Bell, before shifting into ride design later in his career, including Pirates of the Caribbean and the Haunted Mansion at the original Disneyland. The thinking at the time was that Florida already had its own deep, lived-in history with piracy. Actual pirates operated in Florida waters for centuries, so Disney executives figured local and regional guests wouldn't find a fictionalized pirate ride all that novel. Instead, they wanted to give Florida's Frontierland something nobody had ever seen: an enormous Wild West boat ride called the Western River Expedition, designed by the same man who had designed Pirates of the Caribbean in California in the first place. The scale of what Davis had planned is genuinely hard to overstate. Guests would have entered through a fake mine shaft on the banks of a recreated Mississippi River, boarded wooden launches, and drifted through a series of caves and canyons filled with audio-animatronic cowboys, Mexican bandits, and a cast of Wild West characters, all narrated by an animatronic owl named Hoot Gibson. Along the way, riders would have passed through a saloon-filled town called Dry Gulch, encountered a runaway train robbery sequence, and drifted past sweeping recreations of desert canyon scenery built entirely indoors, with a show building large enough to simulate the openness of the real desert rather than a cramped indoor set. The ride would have climaxed with the boats shooting backward up a man-made waterfall, an effect nobody had attempted at that scale before. The whole thing was to be housed inside and around a massive mountain feature called Thunder Mesa, complete with its own runaway mine train ride, a canoe flume, and hiking trails circling the outside. Davis spent roughly 5 years developing the concept, and Disney executives, including Roy Disney himself, reportedly loved it. So what killed it? A combination of bad timing and bad luck, plus a healthy dose of runaway ambition. Guests kept showing up at the brand new Magic Kingdom asking where Pirates of the Caribbean was. And the pressure to just build the ride everyone already knew and loved eventually won out over the ambition of building something completely new. At the same time, the 1973 oil crisis sent Walt Disney World into a serious cost-cutting mode, and money that might have gone to Western River Expedition instead kept Space Mountain's already poured foundation from going to waste. The projected cost of Western River Expedition itself had also been steadily climbing for years, partly because the ride's show building was designed to be massive enough to recreate an entire open desert landscape indoors, something no attraction had really attempted at that scale before. Mark Davis, the project's single biggest advocate inside the company, retired in 1977, and without him pushing for it, Western River Expedition simply had nobody left in the room fighting for its survival. When ground finally broke on Big Thunder Mountain Railroad in January 1979, Davis tried one last compromise: build the roller coaster, but still squeeze in a scaled-down version of his boat ride next to it, with just the boat sequence and none of the surrounding hiking trails. Disney said no. Frontierland wouldn't get a water-based attraction of its own until Splash Mountain opened in 1992, 13 years later, and by then, Western River Expedition was a legend among Disney fans, rather than an actual ride anyone could visit. Fragments of it did survive in unexpected places. A bandit scene from the concept resurfaced in the old World of Motion attraction at Epcot, and a backward waterfall sequence eventually turned up, almost unchanged, in Epcot's Norway Pavilion boat ride, first as Maelstrom and later reworked into Frozen Ever After. Even the town Davis designed for the ride, a mesa-side settlement called Dry Gulch, left a visual fingerprint on Frontierland-style towns Disney built decades later at other parks around the world. Number 3, the Equatorial Africa Pavilion. Epcot's World Showcase has represented dozens of countries since it opened in 1982. But for decades, guests strolling around the lagoon may have noticed something a little strange. There's a gap between China and Germany that's never quite matched the scale of the rest of the park. That gap exists because an entire African pavilion was supposed to go there, and it came startlingly close to actually happening, closer, according to most Disney historians, than any other unbuilt World Showcase pavilion ever got. The Equatorial Africa Pavilion, sometimes called the African Nations Pavilion in early planning documents, was announced before Epcot Center even opened, and it was actively promoted on billboards and in park guidebooks well into the 1980s. Television host Danny Kaye even stood at the future pavilion site during a CBS special celebrating Epcot's opening in October 1982 and told viewers he couldn't wait to come back and tour it. Concept art shows a 60-foot treehouse serving as the pavilion's central landmark, with guests riding an elevator up through its trunk to look out over a projected savannah scene at dusk. A live outdoor amphitheater show called Heartbeat of Africa was planned, featuring African musicians and dancers, alongside a second, filmed attraction meant to walk guests through the culture and history of equatorial African nations. Here's the detail that makes this one sting a little more than most unbuilt Disney projects. Imagineers didn't just sketch this pavilion out, they actually got far enough into production to shoot 2 complete films intended for the pavilion's attractions, working with Alex Haley, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Roots, who signed on as a creative consultant and was slated to narrate part of the experience. 2 finished films, sitting in the Disney archive, that guests have simply never been allowed to see. So why did it fall apart? Money, mostly, along with the same logistical headache that killed several other planned World Showcase pavilions. Disney's original World Showcase business model relied on individual countries or corporations sponsoring their own pavilions to help cover construction costs. Equatorial Africa wasn't a single nation, it represented a whole region, and getting multiple African governments to agree on funding, representation, and messaging turned out to be far harder than lining up a single country's tourism board. It wasn't the only planned pavilion to hit that wall either. Spain and Israel were both promoted in early Epcot Center guidebooks alongside Equatorial Africa, and neither ever got built either. Israel's fell apart over regional security concerns, while Spain's, which would have featured a film about Spanish vacation spots and a ride themed around the country's art and heritage, simply never found a sponsor willing to foot the bill. Of the 3, Equatorial Africa went the furthest by a wide margin. Disney legend Ken Anderson, one of the pavilion's key designers, gave a detailed slide presentation on the project's history at a Disney fan convention in the summer of 1992, timed as a tribute to Alex Haley, who had died that February, underscoring just how much creative work had gone into a pavilion the public would never actually get to walk through. Reports over the years also point to friction and controversy connected to the project's development slowing momentum through the 1980s. By the time interest cooled entirely, the site between China and Germany had sat vacant for so long that Disney eventually filled the gap with a much smaller, generic marketplace area, now known as the Outpost. Some of the ideas that were originally meant for this pavilion, the elevated walkways, the savanna theming, the focus on African wildlife and culture, didn't vanish completely. A lot of that creative DNA is generally understood to have fed directly into the design of an entirely different, much larger park that opened 16 years later, Disney's Animal Kingdom. Number 2, Beastly Kingdom. Speaking of Animal Kingdom, here's a project that almost existed inside that very park, sitting right next to the dinosaurs and safari trucks. An entire land built around dragons, unicorns, and sea monsters, planned since before the park even had a name. When Imagineers were first designing Disney's Animal Kingdom in the early 1990s, they built the whole concept around 3 categories of animals. Animals that exist today, animals that used to exist, and animals that never existed at all outside of myth and imagination. The first 2 became Africa and Asia, and Dinoland, USA. The third became a proposed land originally nicknamed Mythia, later renamed Beastly Kingdom, split between a light, whimsical fantasy realm and a darker, more dangerous dragon's territory. Disney was confident enough in the concept that it appeared in early park marketing, and pieces of the idea even turned up in tie-in merchandise, including a McDonald's Happy Meal toy promotion before the land itself was ever built. The plans that survive from this era are genuinely elaborate. The light side of Beastly Kingdom was going to include a swan boat ride, a hedge maze called Quest for the Unicorn, complete with a topiary castle and a hidden grotto reveal at the end, restaurants themed around Loch Ness and Mother Goose, and gardens filled with sculpted mythical creatures. Disney even planned to tie the land into the park's opening day Discovery River Boats cruise, which ferried guests along the park's central waterway and was meant to point out glimpses of Beastly Kingdom's mythical residents from a safe distance as the boat passed by, well before guests could ever actually set foot in the land itself. The dark side centered on Dragon's Tower, a suspended, inverted roller coaster that would have sent guests swooping through a scorched Dragon's Keep on bat-winged ride vehicles. Reportedly Disney's first attempt at an inverted coaster anywhere in its parks. There were even plans for a fire-breathing dragon effect visible from that same river cruise, giving every guest, regardless of whether they entered Beastly Kingdom itself, a glimpse of what the land promised. None of it made it to opening day in 1998, and the reasons come down to the oldest story in theme park development: money and timing. Animal Kingdom ran wildly over budget just building and staffing its live animal habitats, which left little room for an entire additional fantasy land on top of everything else. Then, CEO Michael Eisner reportedly had to choose between greenlighting Dino Land USA, time to tie in with Disney's upcoming animated film, Dinosaur, or continuing to fund Beastly Kingdom, and he picked the dinosaurs. Beastly Kingdom got pushed to a theoretical Phase 2 of the park that never actually arrived, and the site set aside for it sat mostly undeveloped, home to a temporary character meet-and-greet area called Camp Mini Mickey for nearly 2 decades. There's an odd postscript to this story that Disney fans still debate. Around the time Beastly Kingdom was quietly shelved, a number of Imagineers who had worked on the concept reportedly left the company, and some of them landed at rival theme park operator Universal, which not long after opened its own fantasy and dragons-themed area at Islands of Adventure, complete with a dueling roller coaster pairing, not unlike the inverted coaster Disney had sketched for Dragon's Tower. Nobody at Disney has ever officially confirmed a direct connection, and it's entirely possible it's coincidence. Dragons and roller coasters aren't exactly a novel combination in the theme park industry, but the timing has fueled Disney fan speculation for years regardless. The land didn't stay empty forever, though. In 2017, 19 years after Animal Kingdom's opening, Disney finally built something on that exact plot of land, Pandora, the world of Avatar, developed in partnership with filmmaker James Cameron. It isn't dragons and unicorns, but there's something fitting about the fact that Animal Kingdom's designated fantasy creature land eventually got its mythical residents after all, just from a different franchise than anyone originally planned. Even some of the attraction types carried over in spirit. Pandora's Navi River Journey is a slow-moving boat ride, not unlike the swan boats once planned for Beastly Kingdom's light side, and Flight of Passage, Pandora's flagship ride, gives guests a soaring, creature-riding experience that isn't so different in feeling from what Dragon's Tower was meant to deliver. If you know where to look today, there are still a few quiet leftovers of the original idea scattered around the park. A dragon worked into Animal Kingdom's official logo, a large dragon head sculpture near the park entrance, and a unicorn-shaped parking sign, small fossils of a land that never technically existed. Number 1, Epcot, the city nobody ever lived in. Here's the one that surprises people the most, mostly because the name is still sitting right there on Walt Disney World property maps. Epcot wasn't originally supposed to be a theme park at all. It was supposed to be an actual functioning city, with real residents, real jobs, and real elected, well, actually, not elected, leadership. In October 1966, just 2 months before his death, Walt Disney sat down in front of a film camera and delivered a 25-minute presentation laying out his vision for what he called Epcot, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. This wasn't a vague, hand-wavy dream. Walt described a fully self-contained city built for roughly 20,000 permanent residents, covered by a massive climate-controlled dome at its core, with a monorail connecting every neighborhood and all car and delivery traffic routed underground so pedestrians could move freely at street level. A version of the Wedway People Mover, the same gentle transit ride guests still ride through Tomorrowland today, was meant to be an actual practical transportation system rather than a novelty attraction, quietly shuttling residents between their homes and jobs. Every adult resident would be required to have a job, largely working for Disney itself or for corporations invited to set up shop inside the city, specifically to prevent the kind of urban decline Walt believed was hollowing out American downtowns at the time. Residents wouldn't own their homes. There would be no retirees. As Walt put it in his own words, the city would never cease to be a living blueprint of the future, constantly torn down and rebuilt as new technology emerged, rather than settling into anything permanent. It's worth pausing on just how far this got before it collapsed. Disney didn't just pitch this concept. The company lobbied the Florida legislature to grant Walt Disney Productions its own governmental authority over the land, which is precisely how the Reedy Creek Improvement District came to exist, signed into law by Florida Governor Claude Kirk in May 1967, giving Disney unprecedented control over zoning, building codes, and infrastructure on its Florida property, control the company still exercises in modified form today. A detailed scale model of the planned city, nicknamed Progress City, was built by Disney's design studio to help sell the vision internally and to state officials. Imagineer Bob Gurr recalled Walt standing over that model and pointing to a bench, telling him, "This is where Lily and I will sit when this thing is finished." That's not the language of a man pitching a rough concept. That's a man planning to retire inside his own city. Then, on December 15th, 1966, Walt Disney died of lung cancer, just 6 weeks after filming that presentation. He'd never drawn a formal construction blueprint, and he'd never resolved the messy legal and governance questions that come with actually running a city: how residents would be selected, what rights they'd have, who would be accountable to whom, and whether requiring every adult to hold a job and forbidding property ownership was even something Disney could legally enforce on paying residents. His brother, Roy O. Disney, delayed his own retirement specifically to make sure Walt Disney World opened at all. But Roy was reportedly far less convinced than Walt had been that Disney, a company built on movies and theme parks, had any business also becoming a municipal government. Roy died in December 1971, just 2 months after Walt Disney World's Magic Kingdom finally opened, and with both Disney brothers gone, the company's remaining leadership commissioned study after study on whether an actual Epcot city was even feasible, without ever landing on a clear yes. By the late 1970s, the idea had been scaled down so many times that what remained barely resembled Walt's original pitch. In 1982, 16 years after Walt's death, Disney opened Epcot Center, the theme park version most people know today, full of pavilions, rides, and corporate-sponsored exhibits about technology and world culture, but with 0 permanent residents and 0 functioning city government. The World Showcase section, ironically, grew directly out of Walt's original plan for an international shopping district inside his city center, the same downtown area whose empty lot, decades later, would very nearly have hosted the Equatorial Africa Pavilion covered earlier on this list. Decades later, Disney did eventually build an actual town nearby, called Celebration, Florida, developed and initially wholly owned by Disney starting in the 1990s. But even that project, with its picket fences and small-town Americana aesthetic, aimed for old-fashioned nostalgia rather than Walt's original vision of a genuinely experimental city stuffed with cutting-edge technology and mandatory employment. More recently, Disney has revisited the idea in a far smaller way, partnering with a housing developer in the 2020s to build modestly priced workforce housing near the resort, a project that openly cites Epcot's original community-focused spirit, even though it looks nothing like Walt's domed metropolis. The city Walt Disney actually wanted to build, complete with its climate-controlled dome and elevator-linked monorail grid, has never existed anywhere except in that Progress City scale model, which now sits on permanent display at the Walt Disney World Railroad Station, a monument to easily the single biggest abandoned project in the entire company's history, the pattern behind the kingdom. Looking at these 5 side by side, a pattern starts to show up pretty quickly. Disney rarely abandons a good idea entirely. Pieces of Western River Expedition turned up decades later in Epcot's Norway Pavilion. Pieces of the Equatorial Africa Pavilion turned up in Animal Kingdom's entire design philosophy. Beastly Kingdom's plot of land eventually got its mythical creatures anyway, just wearing blue Na'vi skin instead of dragon scales. Even Discovery Island's name got recycled as the literal hub of the park that replaced it. Walt's original Epcot vision lives on, at minimum, in name, and arguably in spirit every time someone strolls past a World Showcase pavilion that only exists because Walt wanted his city's downtown shopping district to feel like a trip around the world. What actually gets abandoned at Disney usually isn't the idea. It's the specific, expensive, often wildly ambitious version of the idea that the budget, the timing, or, in Walt's case, basic mortality wouldn't allow. The company just keeps circling back around, recycling the good parts, and eventually finding some other, cheaper, more achievable way to build a smaller piece of the original dream. There's also a pretty consistent villain across all 5 of these stories, and it isn't some cartoonish corporate greed. It's just ordinary budget math. Animal Kingdom's live animals ate into the money set aside for Beastly Kingdom. The 1973 oil crisis ate into the money set aside for Western River Expedition. A lack of willing government sponsors ate into the plans for Equatorial Africa. A newer, cheaper-to-run park made Discovery Island redundant. And Walt's death simply removed the one person with both the authority and the personal obsession needed to push an entire experimental city through to completion, leaving a company built for movies and rides holding a half-finished blueprint for local government. None of these are particularly dramatic reasons, as far as corporate history goes, but they add up to a version of Walt Disney World that guests walking through the parks today have almost no way of seeing, a version with dragons in the jungle, cowboys in the canyons, an entire African nation's worth of culture between China and Germany, a working zoo on an island most guests will never set foot on again, and, somewhere underneath all of it, a city of 20,000 people that Walt Disney never got the chance to actually build. If you enjoyed digging into the strange, half-finished corners of Disney World's history, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives like this one. There's plenty more buried in the Disney archives where this came from.